So I'm going to take on both of the prompts here, anti-extraction and the more than human, to offer a framework for sharing some of my recent work. And so where I'm going to go into some detail on some project mentions, I won't on all of them, so I hope that you can go to my website, which is floatwork.com, or on social media, where you can see project statements and the full attributions, because all of this work is in always teamwork. So starting with the more than human. By more than human, I mean just that, every material thing beyond humans. So the more than human is a phrase that comes out of environmental philosophy. So I'm thinking particularly of Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, a phrase to refer to other than human species, but to not other them, to decenter humans. So the phrase gives value to the biological world beyond humans, but also, I think, has the potential to reconnect humans to the greater whole. And I also think that this matters enormously. Talking about her book and about the concept of a larger whole in broader terms, Alex Pauline Gumbs, in Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, writes that this is about undoing a definition of the human, which is so tangled in separation from the living, breathing world, and in domination over the living, breathing world and each other, that's consistently making our lives incompatible with the planet. So if, in this moment, when the human and the more than human injustices of climate change are rooted in a separation of humans from this fragile living world, and simultaneously that the climate change impacts are rooted in the domination of humans over a greater whole. I'm going to turn on this so you can also see it this way. I would argue that there's no more important work than reconnection to the physical, biological, material world. In architecture, this is the work as a practice of relationships, of subverting hierarchies, and in doing so, to offering some resistance to what I see as an avalanche of unchecked greed and the harm that comes from that greed. So this is the work for me in little ways. In this project, this is what I've been calling the watershed. The idea is to amplify multi-species habitat, so in this case especially for snakes underneath, and birds, and anything that can drink water. So you can see that the roof is draining into a vessel that holds the water between the rains. And so this is a really popular place for mammals and birds and insects, or anything that needs moisture on days drier than this one. And that the vessel is also a step for people to come into the studio, trying to weave some habitat, human and more than human here. Or also in the outside house. So this is an experiment, a design experiment, in asking the question of what does it mean to live where the land itself comes first. So meant to be a reconnection to the physical, biological, and material world, really focusing on relationships. So in this case, it's to center the land in its complexity as primary, and then to house as minimally as possible the functions of human habitation in the land, sort of secondarily in these smaller structures. I would argue that one thing about decentering humans, and so decentering paradigms of taking or using up, is a necessary focus on time and on material. So this is geological time. You see the rocks here. This is a rather young lava field, or lava flow, less than 300 years old. A focus on the weather and on relationships between materials. So here you can see the relationship between the lava and the physical and biological environment over time. So as the architect Aldo Rossi wrote in a scientific autobiography, he wrote, "Architecture is made possible by the confrontation of a precise form with time and the elements. This is a confrontation which lasts until the form is destroyed in the process of the combat." So Rossi's tempo, in Italian, both meaning time and the elements, anticipates Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost's foundational anthology of feminist New Materialism, Ontology, and Agency and Politics. In that volume, they write, "Our existence depends from one moment to the next on myriad microorganisms in diverse higher species, on our own hazily understood bodily and cellular reactions, and on pitiless cosmic motions, on the material artifacts and natural stuff that populate our environment." In this project, the land. So in New Materialist philosophy, the physical material of the world exists outside of imposed hierarchies, identity-based power structures, and independent of perception-based ontologies. So physical materials are not inert, but are, in the words of Jane Bennett in the book Vibrant Matter, key actants. So recently visiting this project that started out shiny, I'm seeing the volcanic dust, that's what the red is, lichens and the microbiome of the wood, and all the insects that are reptiles that are living up in the layers here, that those are the primary actants. So the point is that this is a view of material as vibrant, vital, and primary, and also that there can be in this place, and as in everywhere, no separation between humans and the more than human world. So understanding and practicing architecture as a materialist practice, I'm arguing, is a step toward undermining a humans versus nature dualism. So, like I say, with that deference to material is also a deference to time and the kinds of changes that take place over time, and then the various cultural constructions of time. So the editors of the volume Feminist Spatial Practices describe revolutionary time as an alternative temporal mode that rejects patriarchal conceptions of time, for example, in distinctions made within philosophy between linear and cyclical notions of time that reflect gendered divisions of labor. So this is where time is cycles of reproduction, regrowth, renewal, and at least resisting notions of taking, progress, or similarly of using up. So this is also, touching on this very briefly, is an experiment with dealing with concepts of time and material. So this is a body of work of small topographic models of the space of fossil fuel transportation, and the reason for that will be clear in a minute, I think, that was exhibited in Venice in 2021. So the models are topographies, like landforms, described spatially in XY axes, and also temporally over time, that show things like tides, solar warmth, salmon runs, hydrological cycles. In the topography, the forms are generated by data, so in X, Y, and Z coordinates, usually relational data over seasons and years relative to physical space. So salmon runs over time, in seasonal cycles, flows and tides, and then the shape is coming from the repeating of the physical nature and biological nature of these phenomena. So this is meant to be a remapping of the space of fossil fuel transportation, giving it a new shape that's intended to demonstrate value of this land in terms of ecological holism, nutrient cycling, and habitat biodiversity, again, rather than in terms of extraction and profit. So the new topography is meant to demonstrate human experience of time as cyclical in weather and water levels, in the things that repeat and renew as material decays, as material accumulates. And in this way, the new topography is meant to draw attention to the simultaneous ecological past and the ecological future of these lands. So most of these are in Cascadia here in the Pacific Northwest of the US, but also represent land threatened by fossil fuel transportation, such as in the territory related to the Dakota Access Pipeline. So there's meant to be two things going on here. One is the choices in using the traditional media of architectural representation, the choices that we're making about what kinds of things to represent. So we're giving forms to things we believe have the most real value. So value not in terms of commodities, or not in terms of money or ownership, but in terms of an ecological whole. So I'm choosing to map in terms of winter bird migration rather than in terms of harvest. And in this it's an inventory of value, giving form to reproduction and repetition, relationship over resource. And here, trying to reclaim the tools of architectural representation that so often are more often used for delineations and separations and ownership, and sometimes directly extraction. Okay, so I'm going to pause for an abrupt pivot to check in on anti-extraction and start defining some more types of architectural sites. So we'll come back to questions of time, material, relationships, and the more than human. Okay, so here we are. You are here. I'm going to anchor. It's so special to be here in person in this place. I want to anchor us even more in person. So I'm going to offer. So if you're seeing this space, can I offer you to imagine how your body fits in that space? So I'll just say that this is north. Okay, so if you want to do that and just sort of think, okay, north, east, west, and south. Okay, on the map, you are here. So talking about anti-extraction in terms of fossil fuels, so coal, gas, and oil. So in architectural terms, the site of fossil fuel extraction, I think, is twofold. There's two sites. There's the site of the extraction itself, the fracking site, the oil fields. And then there's the site of major impact, the combustion of the fuels in the atmosphere. So as we feel the impacts of the climate emergency, I would argue that the very most important architectural site here of fossil fuels is the atmosphere itself. This is the site of extraction of the atmosphere. So this is a very thin blanket of gases. And we know that the atmosphere's material characteristics, especially its ability to absorb and retain heat, that they're directly shaped by the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. So two sites, the extraction, the land, and then the combustion, the atmosphere. So we could say, as we're anchoring north, south, east, west, we can also anchor land and atmosphere below and above. So the two architectural sites. So in my work, though, I'm interested in a third space that exists between the spaces of fossil fuel extraction and the atmosphere. And so this is the space of fossil fuel material transportation, the in-between. And then this, I would argue, also the space of intervention. So here we are in the Cascadia bioregion. So this is the bioregion that sits between the tar sands, the gas shales, and the open pit coal mounts of the fossil fuel interior. And then the handful, okay, so I really am going to point, and then the handful of coastal ports that can accommodate the ships that carry the bitumen and the liquefied natural gas and the coal to cities across the Pacific. So in the last 15 years or so, we're under some economic pressure here, driven by profit-fueled pressure for export capacity, right? To be moving fossil fuel products across this region for export. As evidence for this, in 2022, the BC Oil and Gas Commission considered 11 major new projects, 2 new natural gas liquefaction plants, 2 new marine export terminals, and 6 major pipeline construction projects, all in Cascadia, totaling almost 3,000 kilometers of large-scale transmission pipeline. We are in the in-between zone. We are sitting right now here in between the space of extraction, export, and atmosphere. This pressure to move things across Cascadia. It also means that the Pacific Northwest, where we're sitting now, is positioned uniquely for a kind of local control of that movement, and then also local harm because of the movement of those fuels. So I think it's talking about local control or protest or resistance, that the spatial aspects of protest or of resistance are really interesting. So talking about pipelines in particular, pipelines are really hard to build across the Pacific Northwest. So we are nearly impenetrable mountains, maybe even more than that, a lot of wealth, a lot of people who don't want to put up with oil industry in their view sheds. So this would be, as in the major transportation corridors, the river valleys, the best ports like Portland, Vancouver, and Seattle. These are major barriers because of that wealth and control. So if you want to find a path of least resistance for your new pipeline, you're limited to some very few isolated routes. So ones that are outside of the viewshed of the power and well. So I understand that this is really different than planning pipeline construction in, say, the Great Plains, where topography doesn't pose as much of a challenge, and maybe kind of wealth and power is a different animal there. So in that case, maybe if one county or one city doesn't want a pipeline, you can just shift a bit smoothly one way or another, ending up, as we've seen, threading right through communities that are most disenfranchised, maybe because of this, threading right through tribal land, as we've seen with the Dakota Access Pipeline and others. So here in the Northwest, protesting fossil fuel pipeline construction in some ways is a little bit easier, because if you block a train, a coal train, a pipeline, proposed or existing, or a port, there's fewer ways around. There's pinch points. And this is student work from Susanna Davey showing the export and then also the potential for pinch points for blocking the movement of coal in this linear space. Okay, so just as we're threaded with the surveyed routes and sites of proposed pipelines and other facilities, the Pacific Northwest is also dotted with blockades that are impeding the movement of construction equipment. So taking advantage of the pinch points. So 2015, blocking by kayaks and people rappelling down a bridge of a Royal Dutch Shell icebreaker. 2020 until now, every day now, land defenders using physical blockades and other peaceful delay practices to impede the coastal GasLink workers from travel on roads in interior British Columbia. The list goes on. Many forms of organized resistance taking advantage of local control. So in this context, there was a very significant new natural gas pipeline proposed across southern Oregon. This is nearest to home, to again, similarly, to move natural gas from Canada to export ports. So in my own practice, I saw this as opportunity to use design to engage this the space of resistance. So at the time, I looked back at a sketch that I did for a design competition in the Kango Kuma lab at Todai way back in 2013. And so the idea was for a circular cross-section of a pavilion roofed in a spiral with some kind of thatch, where only one side of the cross-section is decent shelter for humans, and the other side is habitat for other things, capturing water and nutrients, rotting. So at this time, I was most interested in nutrient cycling and also trying to subvert the hierarchy of human and habitation, and interested in multi-species habitat and also of temporary structures. So I had the chance to design and fabricate 3 pavilions based on the sketch. So I'm skipping over a lot of design and iteration that we went through to get this right, and then to install them a couple of years ago along the proposed routes of the Pacific Connector pipeline. So here's prototypes. If you're interested, it's triangulated truss with kind of complicated layering. So it's essentially 2 hexagons offset, with a shout out to the team, including recent grad student Mike Quillos. So here's the basic diagram, as in that sketch, right? So the loose thatch is spiraling around each of what we're calling the portals, shedding rainwater down one side, and then on the other side collecting water and nutrients. So it's very especially on that side, it's very terrible shelter for humans, and very active habitat for other species. Okay, so the line is the proposed route of that pipeline. So connecting to the interior and then connecting to a proposed liquefaction plant at Coos Bay called the Jordan Cove. And then each of the little lines is a water crossing, and then each of the big portals is a portal location. So each of these 3 sites is ecologically rich. So one is an estuary, one is a wetland, and one is a river edge, riparian. And each of the sites has been stewarded for biodiversity already by the land stewards, for biodiversity and cohabitation with other species. So let's see, what do we have? Okay, so construction. So speaking of anti-extraction, I want to say the project was done at the U of O, but outside of studio structure, and that students were hired as paid attributed research assistants in my research group Float. So the portals are intended to very specifically transform perception of the places subject to fossil fuel transportation development by demonstrating their value in other terms. So this should sound familiar related to other work. Other terms of ecological holism, of nutrient cycling, of multi-species sheltering and habitat biodiversity, again, rather than in terms of extraction and profit. So they're meant to shape the way public sees these places in person and then also in images, still or moving, of the places. Moving. Okay, so there's 3 of them. This is the salmon portal. This one's in the Umpqua watershed. So at the salmon portal, over your right shoulder, you can see into the creek, into the riffles, where there's a salmon and lamprey spawning ground. And then the other way, you can see the home of the family who actually rebuilt the salmon habitat, removed some barriers to re-welcome salmon back to that watershed. So this is in the riparian zone. It's at the edge of a creek. Let's see, and if the pipeline were built, it would have crossed the creek just downstream from here. The portals are also about the space of gathering and kind of symbolic inhabitation. And my favorite gathering here was of a group of folks who were arrested in former Governor of Oregon Brown's office a couple of years ago, who had intentionally trespassed in civil disobedience in protest of the pipeline construction. So here is us harvesting the tule. This is a plant, a wetland plant, just near where the portal was built. So we harvested it from this irrigation pond, brought it back to Eugene, dried it before using it then to thatch the portal. So it was amazing to use an enormous quantity of the building material and then to see the same pond the next year with as much regrown and happy turtles swimming around. And I will say that is not my usual Home Depot experience. So this is the second one. This is the Coquille portal. That's the Coquille portal over your right shoulder. You can see the water seeping up, depending on the time of year, into a marshy pond. It has migrating birds and a lot of frogs. Frog eggs this time of year, frogs soon. And in this case, again, there's agricultural outbuildings of the family home and then the waterway. And then if constructed, the pipeline would cross just to the west of the wetland. This is not a space of traditional measures of wealth, but of other measures. So here's the seeds for the material of that thatch. So this is Juncus ephesus, or soft brush, which is the thatching for this one that was cut here on the Haynes Inlet on the other site. So these are bundles tied in Eugene for going back, ready to go back to one of the sites. So this is the third. This is the Haynes Inlet portal, and this is on an estuary arm of the Coos Bay, and it's along one of the proposed crossings of the Coos Bay to the liquefaction plant. And this one has quite a variety of non-human inhabitants, right, including aquatic ones, because the tide comes up through this structure. So because it's an estuary, it has a really long species list: marbled murrelet, egrets, geese, herring, salmon, crabs, bobcat, otters, bears, and bats. And I think, though, that those are the ones that are easy to name, but there's many at all scales, and including the microbiome. And I think that the estuary itself is not even an aggregation of species and material, that it's a whole living, breathing being in itself as the tide comes in and out. So each of the portals is essentially the same. Each one is meant to shape visitor experiences with seating, shelter, and views. To be inhabited by people just on the one side where there's some shelter. The floor is built up to the entry edge, but is pulled back from the sort of far edge so you can look down. But the bench starts once you're well in and kind of overlooks on the view side. We actually could paddle we have paddled through it in this one. So the portals are, speaking of tides, intended to choreograph human experience of time as cyclical in weather, tides, water levels, and planetary movement, and as material decays and accumulates. So in this way, the pavilions are meant to draw attention to the simultaneous ecological past, again, and future of these lands. But back to the idea of pinch points and trying to intervene in the construction of a pipeline on this site. I believe in resistance. I believe in nonviolent resistance. And I believe that it's most powerful when the fundamental wrongness of something is made visible. And that can be most true when something that is the subject of care is in the path of harm. And I'm hoping that the images and experiences of the three portals magnify the immeasurable good of the indivisible ecosystem communities, and that they make it impossible to miss the truth that the construction of a gas pipeline in these places is visibly, immeasurably wrong. But it's not to say that the good thing in the face of harm is the portals themselves at all. The portals are really temporary and disposable. But the thing of value is the land itself, dynamic, inseparable, more than human whole. And my hope is that the portals shape perception of that profound and messy value of the places, and that they could bring out a shared and a profound sense of care for the places. So the portals have been in place for 3 years now, and the species list is broad. I think notably bats are roosting in this one, and a mink is in residence at another one. They have a lifespan of about 2 or 3 years. We say I think they're in their end of life as moisture and nutrient cycling begin to erode this lightweight fur construction. And as with time, they're becoming, I would hope, even richer habitats for moss and algae, mycelium, and then the many other organisms for which these dynamic environments can also be habitat. So the plant material of the pavilions becomes part of the nutrient cycle, and then ideally only the several pounds of coated steel hardware will remain to be collected for resmelting. So the lifespan of the portals is short, and then the materials that make up the construction, as in all buildings, are part of perpetual cycles of biological succession and plant and forest materials. Okay, so for the permit application for this pipeline has been withdrawn. So these spaces are no longer specifically threatened by pipeline development. But pressure is continuing, especially in Canada, in the northern part of the Cascadia ecoregion. There's several new pipelines under construction, including across unceded indigenous land. It's a space of, the Cascadia continues to be a space of enormous threat, or the pipeline fossil fuel industry in this space continues to be an enormous threat to indigenous sovereignty and ecosystem integrity. So this is a threat of toxicity to communities in terms of construction worker man camps and from the harm of occupation, as measured in missing and murdered indigenous women and drugs, all associated with the camps. This is well documented. They're a threat of toxicity to the atmosphere, as measured in catastrophic climate change, and a threat of toxicity to the immediate environments and the physical space of the pipelines. So here in Cascadia, and also within our shared atmosphere, the fossil fuel environment and its human and ecological health impacts really do reinforce the factual inseparability of the human body from the more than human whole. So in this context, I'll leave you with a question from my colleague, thought leader Stacy Alaimo. In her work, Bodily Nature, she asks, what does it mean to be human in these times with bodies that are inextricably interconnected with our physical world? And I'll add the question, what does this inseparability mean for our work and for our own design practices? So with that, I'll pass it to Chris.